everybody. So good to have all of you here together, us all to be together. Just excited about that. Thank you for coming out. Good to have you at WellSpring. If there's anything I can do, or anything our staff can do, I'm Andy, one of the guys here on staff. Would love to help you out however we can. Just excited that you're here. We're wrapping up a series today, if you've not been with us, called the Scarlet Thread. You've seen the line going across the room here, the video. All of that is to point to the idea that God is at work throughout our world and our culture, throughout history, and He's at work today. And so we're looking for that scarlet thread, looking for His work, to see it in action and be a part of it. And to wrap up the series today, I want you to turn to Joshua chapter 4. It's page 147 in the Bibles there in your seats. I would love for you to look at that if you can. Now, just to give you an idea of where we're going, if you've not been with us or if you're not familiar with this story, out of the first couple of chapters of Joshua, God's people had been enslaved in Egypt. So they were there for 400 years. They had been in slavery. Moses came through God's power and led them out of Egypt. Some miraculous ways. They had gone out to the promised land to cross across the Jordan River. That was kind of the gateway to the promised land. And they got right up to the edge of crossing in, and they doubted God. And so God said, okay, you can't come in then. You're going to have to wait till this generation dies off. Moses is going to die off, and I'll raise up a new generation who will trust me. And so once all of them go, 40 years later, then a new generation will go. Joshua will lead the people in, and this is where we're at. So last week, if you weren't with us, you can catch all these online or on the app. Last week, they crossed over the Jordan River through mighty power of God. Now, there's a cool little story in the story that we're going to look at today that I really haven't caught before, and I want you to make sure you catch it, because it's just a visual picture, and I think it should be made into a movie. So if any of you have Steven Spielberg friendship on Facebook or something, if you could point Joshua 4 to him, that would be great. If James Cameron is your uncle, anybody that has that situation, Joshua chapter 4, I need you to fight with me for this. I'd be glad to help you. And I'll show you that as we get to it in just a moment. Joshua chapter 4, let's start in verse 1, if we can do that together. It says, when the whole nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, choose 12 men from among the people, one from each tribe, and tell them to take up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, from right where the priests are standing, and carry them over with you, and put them down at the place where you stay tonight. Now, one little thing that you need to catch this visually, that may not pop off the screen, says when the whole nation had crossed over, Joshua told these 12 guys to get stoned. So that means the 12 guys are on which side of the Jordan? They all started on the east side. They all made their way over to the west side. They'd already crossed over, right? The whole nation had crossed over. So now he's telling these 12 guys who had already crossed over, 12 leaders from their tribes, I want you to go back into the river, get 12 stones, and come back out. That's important. You'll see why in just a second. Verse 4. Verse 4 says, so Joshua called together the 12 men he had appointed from the Israelites, one from each tribe, and he said to them, go over before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder, probably fairly large, heavy, according to the number of tribes of the Israelites, to serve as a sign among you. So they'd already crossed over. Now they're going back in to get these 12 stones. But why did he have them do it? He's going to build a statue, a monument to this event. But why would you do that? I think he did it because it's important to turn moments into monuments. It's an important thing for us. You know, we do that all the time in our world, in our culture, even in church. We take communion every week to memorialize the moment Jesus died on the cross and raised again from the dead. We want to remember that moment, so we've created an event around it. We created a monument, if you will, around that. And we need that to have this time. And this is going to be a physical monument. They're going to build these 12 rocks that they took out of the middle of the Jordan River. They're going to build them out here on this side, and they're going to create a monument. It's going to be a conversation starter. So every time going forward, when people pass by that way, he encourages them to stop and have a conversation with your kids or your grandkids about what this monument means, about what God did right here in this place. You know, in our lives, it's easy to forget all of the things that God does. Our world goes too fast, and we forget the moments. We have these moments where God is clear and things are real and something powerful happens, and then we get busy in life, and God knows that we do that. That's why he told him to build a monument. There's cool moments we're in right now. As a church, we're building this building, going to expand to that. That's all coming along really well. We're going to start a campus in Columbia. These are all moments that we're going to celebrate together, things that God has done as a church. And it's our responsibility as leaders, men and women in the church, as leaders, influencers here, to turn these moments into monuments. Not saying, look what we did. That's not the right idea at all. But look what God did. Look what God is doing. And it's so vital that we not only do that for each other to remind ourselves, but for our kids. You're going to see the kids are a big part of this. So to help your kids have this experience as well. Now I want you to notice the specific language. It's very clear, starting there in verse 6. Verse 6 says, you'll build these to serve as a sign among you. It says, in the future, when your children ask you, what do these stones mean? Tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off, and these stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever. Who cut the water off? He's very specific. When did the water cut off? What was in front of the water? It's important to me that you notice this. It says in verse 6 there, it says, when the where's it at? I can't read. Before the flow of the Jordan was cut off, before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. That's the presence of God. It says, when the ark of the covenant, the presence of God, when it crossed the Jordan, the waters were cut off and stood up in a heap. So it's a monument to God. This is not a monument to Joshua's leadership or the people's courage or any of those things. That's all fine. This is a monument to God and what he did. He cut off the waters. He led the people. He can be trusted. And we've always got to remember when we have these moments, it's so natural because we're all a little narcissistic for us to take these moments and try to turn them into something about us. It's not about us at all. I mean, right now it's still kind of dangerous out in that area, but soon they'll finish that up and they'll pour a concrete pad and we'll be able to walk out there. And we look forward to taking little tours out there and showing you guys around. And I want to encourage you now, in case I forget to tell you later, when you go out there, if you've got your kids with you or grandkids, whatever, bring them along. And show them this is not just about a building, bricks and mortar. This is about a monument to what God is doing, helping more and more people follow him. It's not about us. It's about him. It's not about buildings. It's about people. And kids may not pick up on that unless you coach them, unless you help them see that moment. So I want to invite you to do that. It's a monument to his faithfulness and his power. Look at verse 8 and 9. It says, so the Israelites did as Joshua commanded. They took 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan River, according to the number of tribes of the Israelites, as the Lord had told Joshua, and they carried them over with them into the camp, where they put them down. And Joshua set up the 12 stones that had been in the middle of the Jordan River, the spot where the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant had stood, and they are there to this day. Now look what happens next. This is where it gets good. Verse 10. Now the priests who carried the ark remained standing in the middle of the Jordan River until everything the Lord had commanded Joshua was done by the people. That's critical. So they walk into the Jordan, the water parts, they have to stand there until everybody gets through and everything that Joshua commanded was done. So when the 12 guys came back in to get stones, they had to stand there that whole time. It says, and them of the people, just as Moses had directed Joshua, and the people hurried over. Now what's that talking about? The people hurried. So everyone was watching as everybody comes across. So you know as the last people are coming across, that everybody's watching them and they all get across. And then Joshua says to the 12 guys, all right, you go back in, you get the rocks. They were heavy. That took probably a few minutes. And then once they left, then Joshua said, okay, priest, now you can come out of the water. And they came up out of the waterbed. And it says they hurried. Now this is the part that Steven Spielberg missed. So you need to make sure he catches this because this is a key part of the deal. They hurried. What's that talking about? Well, God does it in this passage as he does sometimes in other passages where he goes back, he tells the story, and then he goes back and retells a little part of it with more detail because we missed it. We didn't catch why they hurried. But I'll show you. Look at verse 15. Verse 15 says, then the Lord said to Joshua, this is him retelling it, command the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant of the law to come up out of the Jordan. So Joshua commanded them, come up out of the Jordan. And as the priests came up out of the river carrying the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, no sooner had they set their feet on the dry ground than the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and ran at flood stage as before. Now, if you weren't with us last week, let me make sure you catch this. When God said he parted the water, he said, as soon as you step in with the ark, I'm going to pile the water up in a heap in a place called a dam. And that wasn't right there where they were. That was 18 miles upstream. So God said, as soon as you step in, I'm going to stop the water 18 miles upstream. So when they step out of the water, and it says it comes in right behind them, no sooner than they had stepped out, what does that mean about when God released it? It was before. So they take their last step out, and the water comes right back to flood stage as it was before, up to a mile or so wide, up to 100 feet or so deep, one of the fastest flowing rivers in all the world. So now what does that mean? When it says that phrase, no sooner, you know what the original Hebrew is, what it literally means, the no sooner part? It means no sooner. That's why they wrote no sooner on there. That is what that means. So you've got this river as much as a mile wide, as much as 100 feet deep, fastest flowing river in all the world. It comes back 18 miles away, back to flood stage, no sooner than they'd stepped out. What that means is these people were a half mile behind the ark. We did that last week. They had to make up the half mile to the river, cross the mile-wide river, and then go. There's 2 million people going a mile and a half. That's a long time the priests were holding it. And the water got released before they all got out. That means the last few hundred people that were crossing the river probably heard it coming. And then Joshua said, as they hear it coming, hey, 12 guys, go back into the river and get 12 stones. As they hear it coming. And then they go get the stones, and the priests can't move until Joshua says, and they can't do it till the guys get out of the river. So they're probably watching it coming as these 12 guys are picking out their stones. You know, I don't want that one. I'm not sure I want this one. They're holding it saying, hey, boys, I need you to hurry up just a little bit. And no sooner than they step out than the water comes in at flood stage. That's a cool picture to me. And God planned all of that just so. So when it says in verse 10 that the people hurried over, you ain't a kidding, right? I mean, there's some hurrying going on here, right? To me, this moment had to be so powerful. So here you are, just picture you're among the people. You're standing on the west side of the Jordan River, mile wide, very deep, very fast flowing. And this morning, you were on the east side of the Jordan River, and the only way you're here versus there is because God made it so. And that's my story. I mean, spiritually, that's my story. I was enslaved. I was wandering spiritually on the east side of the Jordan, if you will, and God made a way for me to come across. Jesus died for my sins. God came into my life and changed everything. I was forgiven. I was healed. God's Spirit came to live inside of me, and all of that happened from one side to the other just because of God. It wasn't because of me. I didn't do anything spectacular, and now I'm here. And even the picture of baptism is powerful. Here they are crossing from slavery to the promised land through the water. And then God gives us this picture of baptism as a moment. Like, it's all just powerful to me. And they were standing there. And it's bigger than just this miracle. You've got to remember that. For 40 years, their parents had told them, if you ever get a chance to do this, do it better than us. I mean, can you picture the parents? They would have said things like, if God ever gives you a chance to enter the promised land, learn from our mistakes. If God ever gives a second chance, we want to see our grandkids see the power of God just as we did. We watched God do amazing things in Egypt. We watched him part the Red Sea. Then we doubted. If you ever get a chance to do this better, do it better than we did. And now here they are. They're leaders of the community. They're probably in their 40s and 50s. They've got kids and grandkids coming along behind them, and they just did it. They were on the east side of the Jordan, and now they're on the west side of the Jordan because God said so. After 400 years of slavery, after 40 years of wandering, they're in the promised land. Can you imagine what that moment must have felt like? And not only that, but to see the water part before the priest and the ark, to see it come rushing in behind them as soon as they stepped out, that's a powerful moment. These folks had changed their family tree forever. I mean, their grandparents were slaves, literally, in Egypt. Their parents wandered around faithlessly in the desert, and now they are residents of this promised land that God had told them about all those years before. So what about you? I mean, how are you changing the family tree? Because just like they had slaves and wanderers in their past, you got some wild cards in your family tree as well, some of you, and you're going to change it one way or the other. So you've had handed down to you things like addiction or greed, affairs, gossip, anger, aggression. You've had all that stuff handed down to you. And you get to decide what you're going to do with the family tree. You get to decide what you're going to hand to your kids. They had ancestors who were slaves and ancestors who were wanderers, and I'm pretty sure you did too. You've got some people who were enslaved in your past, in your family tree, some people who were wandering spiritually in your family tree. But the question is not what was handed to you. The question is, what are you handing on past? Because we're all going to change our family tree for one or the other. And God says, I want you to build a monument with these 12 stones to remind you of that transition, that family tree shift, that breaking of the addiction. And these are precious stones. Precious stones. The purpose of these stones is to remember. God gave them very clear instructions. Joshua 4:6 says, in the future, when your children ask, what do these stones mean? Tell them, the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever. So when they saw those stones, what do you think they saw? Like if you could create a sentence, God is blank. What do you think they said when they filled in the blank? Because I'm picturing, I don't know, I'm picturing you would walk by and see dads and their sons talking about the stones, and they were right there, and we're here, and here's what this means. Like, can you picture that? What do you think they said about God when they saw the stones? Well, we don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us, but I want to kind of use our imagination a bit and maybe figure out what they would have said. Let me give you a couple ideas. I think they would tell their kids that God is beyond. He's beyond anything they can do. I mean, there's no way that any one of them could have stopped the waters of the Jordan 18 miles away and had it released at the right time. And all. They couldn't have done that. None of them could have done that. In fact, not only could none of them have done that, none of them altogether could have done that. They don't have all the engineering power that we have today, but even today, we couldn't do that. Imagine the force required to stop a mile-wide, fast-flowing, 100-foot deep river and pile it up in a heap. Now, I didn't do the calculations, but that's Hoover Dam type stuff, right? I mean, that's the same kind of calculation we're talking about. And God did it with his words, not mountains of concrete. God just said, stop and pile up in a heap. 2 million people, men, women, children, crossed over in front of this mile-wide water. And God's just beyond. You know, the temptation today, I think maybe it's always been a temptation, is to shrink God, to make him a little more palatable or a little more relatable. And I get the motivation for that. You know, for a long time, the church would say that, you know, we're sinners in the hands of an angry God, and he's dangling us over like a spider web over hell. And that's hard to relate to. I get that, so we're trying to make God more relatable, more friendly, a kinder, gentler God. I get all of that. But we can never forget that God is beyond. He's beyond us. His ways are higher than our ways. His thoughts higher than our thoughts. He can do things that none of us can do on our own. He can do things that none of us can do all together. We've got to remember that. We see a great example of that from the book of Daniel, about King Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel lived in Babylon. It's modern-day Iraq. Nebuchadnezzar was the king. He was the ruler of Babylon. Babylon was the most powerful nation of the time, and he was the head of the deal. He was the most powerful guy on earth by a long shot. He was wealthy, he was powerful, and he was extremely arrogant. God sends him warning after warning after warning to humble himself. You can read that in the book of Daniel. It's a fairly short book. He says, humble yourself. Call out to the God of heaven. And I think we should, I think we should see that as a warning sign for our culture and our time. Because we, like Babylon, we're wealthy, we're awful proud, and we can be just a twinge arrogant as a people, including me. And I think God has sent us warning after warning after warning after warning, and I don't know that we're listening to it any better than Nebuchadnezzar did. Because Nebuchadnezzar didn't humble himself. He didn't cry out to God. And you see in this passage what happens to Nebuchadnezzar, and I think we can see that as a warning for us as well. Daniel 4:29 says, 12 months later, after his latest warning sign that he ignored, Nebuchadnezzar was taking a walk on the flat roof of the royal palace in Babylon. As he looked across the great city, he said, look, this great city of Babylon, by my own mighty power I have built this beautiful city as my royal residence to display my majestic splendor. And while these words were still in his mouth, a voice called down from heaven, King Nebuchadnezzar, this message is for you. You are no longer ruler of this kingdom. And just like that, it was gone. His wealth, his power, his position, even his sanity. Verse 32 says, 7 periods of time will pass while you live this way, insane, until you learn that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world. He gives them to anyone he chooses. That same hour, the judgment was fulfilled, and Nebuchadnezzar was driven from human society. 7 periods refers to 7 years. He lost everything. Just as quickly and easily as God had given it to him, God took it away. And that's a warning sign for every one of us. It's a warning sign for our nation. It's a warning sign for our culture. It's a warning sign for any particular leader in business or politics. It's a warning sign for us. And after 7 years, just as God predicted, Nebuchadnezzar repented. And we see quotes from 600 BC from Nebuchadnezzar here in the Bible. Nebuchadnezzar writes in his journal, "After this time I had passed, I, Nebuchadnezzar, looked up to heaven. My sanity returned. I praised and worshiped the Most High. I honored the one who lives forever. His rule is everlasting. His kingdom is eternal. All the people of earth are nothing compared to God. God does as he pleases among the angels of heaven and among the people of the earth. Not one person can stop him or say to him, 'What do you do by doing these things?'" And then he continues, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything God does is right and all of God's ways are just. Those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. He can shut you down," is the Andy Huddleston translation of that passage. You don't have to believe in God, but you're going to face him. I don't have to honor him, but I'm going to face him, and he can shut us down. Just as quickly as he gives things to us, he can take them away. And he's beyond anything that you or I can comprehend. I would say to you, if you are not following God and you're in a tight spot, look up to heaven. Humble yourself. Go back to God, and he can come to you, and he can help you, and he can walk you out of that spot that you're in. And if you're not following God and you're in a great spot, your situation is actually a little more dire than the first guy, because you think you're fine. And just as quickly as he gave it to you, he can take it away. And the recipe is the same for you. Humble yourself. Look to heaven. Turn to God. Repent of your pride. Because he can shut you down. Just as quickly as he gives it, he can take it away. Because our God is not like everybody else. He's beyond. And I think they would have saw those stones and been reminded of that. And I think they would have saw those stones and been reminded that God is also trustworthy. I mean, just consider what God said to them. God said, hey, I want you to go stand in this river at flood stage, and when you do, I'm going to dry it up, I'm going to make a way, I'm going to figure it all out. I'll do everything else. You just go stand in the river. And they did, and then he did. And God says, okay, I want you to stand in this river. I want everybody to cross. I want you to get 12 stones, come back out. And right as you walk out, I'm going to release the river at exactly the right time so it comes out right as it was before. They did it, and he did it. And then if you were to read on in this passage, God says, I want you to go into this people with all these fortified cities. You don't really have an army. You're not really trained militarily, but I'm going to handle it. You just walk ahead with me. I'll take care of everything else. And they did it, and he did it. Time and again, God is trustworthy. And that's true for us. God gets us through these moments, and we've got to be reminded of that, because just like he did in the past, he can be trusted to do in the future. God tells us what to do, we do it, and he trusts us. And they would, when they saw those stones from out of the middle of the river, they would have been reminded of the trustworthiness of God. God's not commanded you to build a stone monument. You could do that if you wanted to. That'd all be fine. But God has commanded you to remember all that he's done. Because when you are reminded of what he's done, you'll be reminded to trust him in the future. So how are you doing that for you? How are you building in reminders of the trustworthiness of God for your faith? And more importantly from this text, how are you building in the trustworthiness of God? Reminders of that for your kids and your grandkids. Because they didn't go through the same moments you did. You need to remind them from your moments so that they can trust God for theirs. I love this passage from Numbers 23. Numbers 23 says, God is not a man, so he does not lie. He's not human, so he does not change his mind. Has God ever spoken and failed to act? Has God ever promised and not carried through? I mean, has he ever let you down? Has God ever not done what God said he would do? You don't have to trust men. They're going to do stupid things. You don't trust women. They're going to do stupid things. God is uniquely trustworthy more than anyone else in our world. We've got to separate him out that way. And we need our kids to be able to separate him out that way, because our culture is turning away from God and getting lost among itself. And we've got to be reminded of the trustworthiness of God. If you were to follow that story out, Joshua leads the people in the ark, the presence of God, into the promised land. They drive all the nations out before them. They take over that land. And then David comes along, gives them success militarily and success economically. And then his son Solomon comes along and builds a temple for God right in that land, this promised land. And Later on in Scripture, they bring the Ark of the Covenant in. They put it there in the temple, in the most holy place where God had always designed, so they could come and worship God in their own place, in their own land. And at the dedication ceremony to that temple, Joshua, years later, says, "Praise be to the Lord who's given rest to his people," just as he promised. No longer slaves, no longer wanderers, no longer in battle. Now they have rest, just as God promised. Not one word has failed all the good promises he gave through his servant Moses. May the Lord our God be with us as he was with our ancestors. May he never leave us or forsake us. May he turn our hearts to him, to walk in obedience to him, to keep the commands, decrees, the laws he gave our ancestors, so that all the peoples of the earth, not just God's people, but all the peoples of the earth, may know that the Lord is God and that there's no other. Solomon was looking back over his own lifetime, but beyond that, over the lifetime of the people of God, from slavery in Egypt to wandering in the desert to crossing the Jordan. Now they're a time of rest in this temple. And looking over all of it, he says, not one word has failed of all the good promises God gave. God is uniquely trustworthy. We have to help our kids see that. Be reminded ourselves. So they were reminded of the power of God. They were reminded of the trustworthiness of God. And I think when they saw those stones, they were reminded that God was to be followed. I mean, you've all had people in your life who had a title over you, so you had to obey them when they're watching, but you didn't trust them. I mean, they were your boss on the org chart, so you had to do what they said and all of that. You're getting paid to do that, but they weren't really a leader for you. They weren't an influencer for you. They just had a job title, and so you had to submit to that. But leadership is based on trust. You did things for me in the past, therefore I trust you to follow you into the future. And God's not a title, God's a leader. He's been trustworthy. He's been beyond, so we can follow him into our future. You know, if you were to walk by that monument, I picture you would have, again, fathers talking to their sons, grandpas talking to their granddaughters, arm around them saying, God did this, and he did that, and he did this other. And because God did all of those things, then we could trust him when we go forward. It would have been cool to see that. Just these little moments where they're, mother and a daughter, or mother and a son, father, grandfather, whatever, having these little sit-down moments by this monument. See these rocks? They were right there in that river, and God did that. And so because God did that for us, we can trust him in the future. We can follow him. You know, son, you may have times of fear or doubt or temptation. Don't worry about that. A God who did that for you can be trusted going forward. I think if you had fast forward a couple hundred years, maybe to that same spot, if we could have seen in that same spot, I think that we still had fathers and sons having conversations right there, grandpas with their granddaughters right there in that same spot, but they were talking about different things now. Now they're not talking about the Jordan River and the crossing. Now they're talking about this guy, Jesus, who had taught and loved and healed and done these amazing miracles, had been baptized in the Jordan River, not far from that location. And this same Jesus had been killed on a Roman cross, and this same Jesus had risen from the dead, and they had seen him. And so you might have had fathers talking to their kids right there and saying, son, you may have doubts or fears or worries or confusion. That's all fine. But a God who does that for you, you can trust him. And now the generational baton has been handed to us. And it's time for us to talk to our kids and talk to our sons and daughters and grandkids, and even to our heart and soul and faith, and say, a God who's done these things for you, you can trust him going forward. You may have fears, you may have doubts, you may have confusion. That's okay, because God's beyond all of that, and a God who's done all of these things for us can be trusted going forward. And if I could speak to your heart, I would say to you today, God has brought us, just like the Israelites, from a place of slavery through a time of wandering, now into the promised land of freedom. And that same promise is available to you. And just like he brought them through the water to get them to the other side, he's given us this picture of baptism, where we go through and we come out on the other side following God. And you can follow a leader like that. You can trust a leader like that. If you're here this morning and you're maybe not following God as you should, things are not quite where they ought to be, and you're going through a tough time, I would challenge you that a God who can lead us through these things, he can lead you from the spot you're in. You just got to look to heaven, turn to him, trust him. And if you're here and you're not really following God, or things aren't quite the way they ought to be, and you're going through a great time, I'd especially say to you, pump the brakes, friend. Because just as soon as he's given it all to you, just as easily as he's given it all to you, he can take it all away. Because what he wants is not for you to have all those things. That's great. He loves that. He wants you to have a connection to him. If you're going through life fast and free, it can all come crumbling. And you need to look to the God of heaven. Trust him. Humble yourself. Because he wants to walk this through with you together. Why don't you bow your head and let me pray for you this morning. God, we look to you to lead us through the waters, through the crises, through the scary times, through the good times. We humble ourselves to look to you because you're the God of everything. You're beyond all of our doubts and fears and struggles. You're beyond all of our comprehension and ability. We trust you. And God, we ask that you would help us to see you more clearly. We would help us to understand all that you've done, to look back over our life and see where you've taken us through the waters again and again, and build monuments of faith for ourselves and for our children. We honor you, God, as great and mighty and powerful, beyond anything we can do. We trust you. We choose to follow you. Church, I'd ask that you take a moment to put some legs on that. Remind yourself of the greatness of God. Thank him for his beyondness. And then commit to trust him through the waters you're facing. Commit to follow him through the waters you're facing, even when it doesn't make sense to our eyes. Pray to God, and I'll pray for us as well. God, out of your greatness, you've given us so much. You've given us our life. You've given us our freedom. You've given us love and joy and people in our lives. You've given us Jesus and the cross and the empty tomb. You've given us so much. And we acknowledge your greatness. We acknowledge your power, your beyondness. We praise you for it. We commit to follow you. All in the name of Jesus.